Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You ever get blindsided by something so outrageous, you're left wondering if you're the crazy one? That's exactly how I felt when my parents sat me down last month. Their faces were all serious, almost apologetic. I thought, what now? And then my mom says it. We were wondering if we could stay with you for a while, just until we get back on our feet. I almost laughed, not out of humor, out of sheer disbelief. These were the same parents who sold my childhood home to pay for my sister's wedding. The same ones who never even asked if I wanted a say in it. And now, they're looking at me, waiting for me to say yes like it's the most reasonable thing in the world. Let me back up. This isn't just about a house or a wedding. This is about years of feeling like I was always second place in my own family. You'd think the older kid might get a little more attention or respect, right? Wrong. In my family, everything revolved around my younger sister, Lisa. Don't get me wrong, she's not a bad person, but she's been the golden child since day one. Dance recitals, private tutors, braces that my parents swore we couldn't afford for me. They made sure Lisa had it all. I guess I should have seen it coming when they told me they were selling the house. It was a classic two-story colonial, the kind of place that's in family photos for decades. My dad always called it our little legacy, and then one day, poof, it was gone. The worst part? They didn't tell me until the deal was practically done. We need the money, my dad had said, like it was obvious. Lisa's wedding is going to be a once-in-a-lifetime event. Once in a lifetime? Right. Because my memories in that house apparently didn't count for much. Now, fast forward a few years. Lisa's wedding was the kind of event you see on TV. Hundreds of guests, live band, open bar, the whole 9 yards. Meanwhile, I'm sitting at a table in the back, nursing a watered-down cocktail and trying not to lose it. After that, things got distant. I didn't go home much anymore. What was the point? Lisa and her husband had their new life, and my parents were too busy being proud of how perfect everything turned out. I threw myself into my own life, my career, my tiny apartment that I saved up for on my own. So, when they came to me with this request, all those years of resentment came rushing back. What happened to Lisa? I asked. Why can't you stay with her? My mom looked down at her hands, and my dad cleared his throat. Her place is too small, he said. And well, we thought you might have more room. Here's the kicker. I do have more room. A lot more. After years of scraping by and working overtime, I finally bought a house last year. It's nothing fancy, but it's mine, a little ranch-style place with a yard big enough for a dog I'll adopt someday. But the thought of sharing it with them, after everything, I don't know if I can do it. And here's where I need your input. Am I being selfish for not wanting to help them out? Should I put the past behind me and let them move in? Or is it okay to draw the line here? What would you do? Growing up, our house wasn't just four walls and a roof. It was the place. A white colonial with dark green shutters, a wraparound porch, and a tree swing in the backyard that my dad hung when I was 7. It smelled like fresh-baked cookies on Sundays and faintly of sawdust in the garage where my dad worked on his woodworking projects. Every room held memories. The Christmas mornings when we'd tear through wrapping paper, the kitchen where my mom would teach me how to make pancakes, and even the basement where I'd retreat during thunderstorms, clutching a flashlight and a book. It wasn't perfect, of course. No houses. The plumbing creaked, the AC went out every summer, and there was a patch of wallpaper peeling in the upstairs hallway that nobody ever bothered to fix. But it was ours. Back then, I didn't think about how different things were for me and my sister, Lisa. She's 3 years younger, with the kind of personality that draws people in. Bright, bubbly, the life of every family gathering. I was quieter, more reserved. While she was out making friends and collecting trophies, I was holed up in my room, reading or working on a science project for school. It wasn't until I was older that I started noticing the patterns. Like how Lisa's activities always seemed to take priority. If she had a recital and I had a game, guess who got all the attention? And it wasn't just the small stuff. She got the better birthday parties, the cooler Christmas presents, and when she turned 16, they bought her a car, a bright blue Volkswagen Beetle. I didn't get a car. I got told to save up for one. But the house was my anchor. No matter how unfair things felt, that was the one thing we all had in common. We lived under the same roof, shared the same meals, laughed at the same family jokes. It was the glue that held us together, even when the cracks started to show. When I went off to college, I missed that house more than I missed my family. Coming home for holidays was my favorite part of the year. Even when Lisa got all the attention, I still felt like I belonged there, like it was still my home. But things shifted after I graduated. Lisa was in her mid-20s by then, dating a guy named Todd. He was the kind of guy who always had a story to tell, a little too loud, a little too confident, but nice enough that everyone adored him. My parents were thrilled when he proposed. The wedding planning started almost immediately, and suddenly, the house felt less like a home and more like a wedding factory. Invitations were spread out on the dining room table. Fabric swatches and floral arrangements took over the living room, and every conversation was about Lisa's big day. I tried to stay out of it. Weddings weren't my thing, and honestly, I didn't have much to contribute. But one day, I came home to find my parents in the kitchen, whispering in that way people do when they don't want to be overheard. "What's going on?" I asked, setting down my bag. They exchanged a look before my mom finally said, "We're thinking about selling the house." I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but the look on their faces told me otherwise. "Why would you sell the house?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "We need the money," my dad said, not meeting my eyes. "The wedding's getting expensive, and we don't want Lisa and Todd to start their life in debt." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were selling our home, my home, for a wedding, a one-day event? I wanted to argue, to tell them how unfair it was, but what would it have changed? The decision had already been made. A month later, the for sale sign went up. That was the moment I realized the house had never really been mine. It had always been theirs to give away. They said it was just a house, but to me it was so much more. And the way I found out they sold it? Let's just say it wasn't over a heartfelt family dinner. I found out the house was sold on a random Tuesday. Not from my parents, not even from Lisa. No, I found out from Mrs. Gardner, our next-door neighbor, who'd lived there since before I was born. I was grabbing coffee at the local cafe when she walked up to me with that overly sweet, slightly pitying smile she always wore. "Oh, I hear your parents finally closed on the sale," she said, tilting her head like she expected me to be thrilled. My stomach dropped. "Sale?" I repeated, trying to play dumb. She laughed, the kind of laugh people do when they think you're joking. "Well, I suppose it's hard to let go of a place after so long. But it's for a good cause, isn't it? A big wedding like that. What a blessing." I don't even remember what I mumbled back. Something polite, probably, because Mrs. Gardner wouldn't stop talking. She went on about how much she'd miss seeing us kids running around the yard, how she hoped the new owners would take good care of the place, and how nice it was that my parents were so generous. When I got back to my car, I just sat there, staring at the steering wheel. They hadn't even told me. They sold the house I grew up in, the house that felt like the only stable thing in my life, and I had to hear it from a neighbor. I called my mom as soon as I got home. "Why didn't you tell me you sold the house?" I asked, skipping right past the pleasantries. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "We were going to tell you," she said finally. "When?" I snapped. "When you were handing the keys to the new owners?" "Don't be dramatic," she sighed. "We've been busy with the wedding planning. We didn't mean to leave you out." Leave me out? That phrase hit me like a brick. I'd been left out my whole life. But this was a new low. "How could you sell it?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "You always said the house was part of the family." "It's just a house," she said, like it was no big deal. "What matters is the memories we made there. And those don't go away just because the address changes. Just a house." She said it like she was talking about an old pair of shoes. "Lisa must be thrilled," I said bitterly. There was another pause, this one heavier. "Don't do that," she said. "This wasn't just for Lisa. It was for all of us. We're family. But it wasn't for all of us. It was for Lisa. For her wedding. For her once-in-a-lifetime day, as my dad kept calling it." When the wedding finally came, I was still trying to keep my emotions in check. I didn't want to ruin her big day, no matter how unfair it all felt. But sitting there at the reception, watching Lisa and Todd dance under twinkling lights while my parents beamed with pride, I couldn't help but feel like I didn't belong. I was seated at the back, of course. Not with the family, not with the bridal party, but with a random mix of distant relatives and family friends I hadn't seen in years. My name card was misspelled. An honest mistake, I'm sure, but it felt like a metaphor for my place in the family. The whole evening, I kept replaying my mom's words in my head. It's just a house. Was it just a house when my dad taught me how to ride a bike in the driveway? Was it just a house when my mom let me stay home from school after my first heartbreak and made me chicken noodle soup? Was it just a house when I spent hours painting that mural on my bedroom wall, only to have my dad help me repaint it when I hated how it turned out? After the wedding, I didn't go home for months. Not that there was a home to go back to. My parents moved into a smaller condo across town, and Lisa and Todd bought a house in the suburbs, paid for in part with the leftovers from the sale of our home. You'd think that would be the end of it. They got their wedding, their condo, their picture-perfect life. But years later, when things fell apart, guess whose door they showed up on? The months after the wedding were quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of quiet that comes from knowing something's broken and no one's willing to talk about it. I didn't call my parents much, and they didn't call me either. The relationship felt more like an obligation than a bond, a series of polite, "How are you?" texts that didn't mean much. Lisa, on the other hand, was thriving. She and Todd moved into their new house, a sprawling four-bedroom in a nice neighborhood with a fenced yard and a home gym. Every time I saw her Instagram, it was another post about their perfect new chapter. Their new furniture, their weekend trips, their golden retriever named Bentley. It wasn't jealousy. Not really. I didn't want Lisa's life. What I wanted, what I needed, was for someone in my family to see how deeply their choices had hurt me. But no one ever brought it up. When Christmas rolled around that year, I decided to visit my parents at their new condo. It wasn't home, but I thought maybe the holidays could help us find some middle ground. I walked in with a bottle of wine and a hopeful smile, but the second I stepped inside, I knew something was off. The place was nice enough, smaller, modern, with a lot less personality than the old house. But it wasn't the condo itself that got to me. It was the framed photos everywhere. Every wall, every surface, it was all Lisa and Todd. Their wedding photos, their honeymoon in Italy, a candid shot of Lisa in her wedding dress, laughing with my mom. There were a couple of older family photos tucked in the corner of one shelf, but it was clear who the stars of the show were. "Your sister gave us some of these as gifts," my mom explained when she caught me staring. Of course she did. Lisa had always been good at gifting the kind of things parents love. Perfectly sentimental, perfectly on brand. The evening dragged on, full of small talk and half-hearted laughter. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling that I didn't belong there anymore. But when my dad brought up the house, it all came rushing back. "We're so proud of how everything turned out," he said, raising his glass. The house sale, Lisa's wedding, the condo, it all worked out perfectly. I stared at him, waiting for the part where he acknowledged the cost of it all. But it never came. "Perfectly," I repeated, my voice flat. My mom shot me a warning look. "Don't do this," she said quietly. "Do what?" I asked, setting down my fork. "Say what no one else will? That you sold the one place that felt like home to me, and I didn't even get a say in it? That you did it all for a wedding and never once thought about how it might affect me?" The room went dead silent. My dad looked uncomfortable, and my mom's face tightened. Lisa wasn't there. She was spending Christmas with Todd's family. But I could practically hear her voice in my head, telling me to calm down, to stop making everything about me. "We didn't mean to hurt you," my mom said after a long pause. "We did what we thought was best for the family." "For the family," I repeated, laughing bitterly. Funny how the family always seems to mean Lisa. I left not long after that, and for a while I didn't look back. I focused on my job, my friends, and my life, pretending the gap between me and my parents didn't bother me as much as it did. But every once in a while, I'd see something that reminded me of the old house, a tree swing in someone's yard, a porch with green shutters, and it would hit me all over again. What stung the most wasn't just the loss of the house. It was the realization that my parents didn't value my feelings as much as they valued Lisa's happiness. That I was an afterthought, someone to be appeased with polite excuses and vague reassurances. By the time another year rolled around, I convinced myself that this was just the way things were. I'd learned to keep my distance, to lower my expectations. And then, out of nowhere, my parents called me with their big news. They needed help. They said it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet. But when I asked about Lisa and Todd, their answer made my blood boil. It started with a phone call from my dad. He never called unless it was important. Usually birthdays, holidays, or the occasional "did you see the game" kind of thing. So when his name popped up on my screen on a random Wednesday night, I answered with a mix of curiosity and dread. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" His voice had this hesitant tone, like he was trying to find the right words. "Hey, kiddo, your mom and I were wondering if we could talk to you about something." "Okay, what's going on?" "Well, things have been a little tight for us lately," he said. "With the condo and some other expenses, we're in a bit of a bind." I didn't say anything, but my stomach started to twist. "Anyway," he continued, "we were thinking maybe we could stay with you for a while, just until we get back on our feet." I couldn't help it, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so completely out of left field that I didn't know how else to respond. "Stay with me?" I repeated, as if I'd misheard. "Just for a little while," he said quickly. "We'd stay out of your way. You've got that extra room, and we thought, why can't you stay with Lisa?" I cut him off. There was a long pause, the kind that tells you you're not going to like the answer. "Her place is, well, it's not really an option," he said finally. "Not an option?" I said, my voice rising. "She's got a 4-bedroom house and a husband with a 6-figure salary. but it's not an option. It's complicated, he said, and I could hear the tension in his voice. We didn't want to put her in an awkward position. Oh, but putting me in one is fine. I snapped. Don't be like that, he said a little sharper now. You're always saying how you're independent, how you've got your life together. We thought you'd understand. I wanted to scream. Understand? Understand that the same parents who sold my childhood home to fund Lisa's fairy tale wedding now wanted to move into my house because she couldn't be bothered? I need to think about it, I said, finally, my voice tight. Of course, he said quickly. Take your time. We're hoping you'll help us out. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the floorboards. They wanted to move in with me. The same people who had always made it clear that I was second priority. The same people who sold the only home I'd ever felt truly connected to, without even asking how I felt about it. And Lisa, the golden child? She wasn't even part of the conversation. I couldn't help but replay every slight, every dismissal, every time they put her needs above mine. And now, they wanted me to be the one to bail them out. The worst part? A small part of me wanted to say yes. Not because they deserved it, but because, deep down, I still wanted to be part of the family. I still wanted to believe that helping them might fix some of what was broken. But another part of me, the louder, angrier part, wanted to slam the door in their faces. To let them figure it out on their own, the way I'd always had to. I spent the next few days avoiding their calls. I wasn't ready to give them an answer. Instead, I called a few close friends, hoping for some clarity. You don't owe them anything, one friend said firmly. They made their bed. Let them lie in it. Another friend was more cautious. I get why you're upset, but they're still your parents. If you can help, maybe you should. Both arguments made sense, and neither made me feel any better. By the end of the week, I still didn't know what to do. All I knew was that whatever decision I made, it was going to change everything. They kept saying it was just temporary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that once they moved in, things would never go back to normal. And the more I thought about it, the more I started to realize what this was really about. I spent the next few days in a mental tug-of-war. Every time I thought I'd made up my mind, a voice in my head would pull me in the opposite direction. They're your parents, I'd think. They need your help. But then the anger would creep in. Were they when I needed help? When they sold our house without a second thought? When Lisa's happiness was all they cared about? I avoided calling them back, which only made the guilt worse. I could imagine my mom checking her phone every hour, waiting for me to call. Or maybe she wasn't. Maybe she assumed I'd cave like I always did. By the end of the week, I was no closer to a decision. So, I did what any sensible adult would do. I invited my best friend, Caleb, over to drink wine and talk it out. Caleb had been around long enough to know the whole story. Every unfair moment. Every time I felt like an outsider in my own family. If anyone could help me sort through this mess, it was him. So, what are you going to do? He asked, swirling his glass of red wine like some kind of therapist. I don't know, I groaned, sinking deeper into the couch. I mean, part of me wants to say no. Just flat out no. Let them figure it out on their own. But then I feel like a horrible person for even thinking that. Caleb raised an eyebrow. You're not horrible for setting boundaries. They're adults. They should have planned better. Yeah, but they're my parents, I said, the frustration evident in my voice. And if I say no, I'll be the bad guy. They'll tell everyone I turned my back on them when they needed me. So what if they do? Caleb said, leaning forward. You've spent your whole life trying to make them see you, to get their approval. And has it ever worked? I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came out. Because he was right. They're never going to give you what you want, he continued, his voice softer now. Not the way you deserve it. So maybe it's time to stop chasing it. I hated how much sense he made. Okay, I said finally. Let's say I tell them no. What happens next? Do I just cut them off? Pretend they don't exist? You don't have to cut them off, Caleb said. But you do have to protect yourself. If you're going to let them in literally or figuratively, it has to be on your terms. Not theirs. His words stuck with me long after he left. It wasn't just about whether or not they moved in. It was about setting boundaries, about deciding what I was willing to give and what I wasn't. The next morning I called my parents. My heart was pounding as the phone rang, and for a brief, ridiculous moment, I hoped they wouldn't answer. But, of course, my mom picked up on the second ring. Hi, sweetheart, she said, her voice bright and hopeful. Hi, I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. I've been thinking about your request. There was a pause, and I could practically feel her holding her breath. I can't let you move in, I said, the words coming out in a rush. I need my space. I've worked really hard to build a life for myself, and I'm not willing to give that up. Silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "We understand," she said, though the disappointment was obvious. "I'll help you find somewhere else," I offered quickly, trying to soften the blow. "A rental, maybe, or a cheaper place nearby. But I can't have you living here." "Okay," she said after a moment. "Thank you." The call ended soon after, but the weight in my chest didn't lift. I knew I'd made the right decision, for me at least, but it still felt awful. Later that week, I found out they'd asked Lisa first. She said no, not because her house was too small, but because she and Todd didn't want the hassle. I couldn't even be mad. Of course, Lisa came first, even in their rejection. After everything, I thought that was the end of it. But what happened next made me question if I'd made the right call, or if I just burned the last bridge with my family. After the call with my mom, I expected things to go quiet for a while. Awkward, strained silence had become the norm between us over the years, so I wasn't surprised when days went by without a word from them. What I didn't expect was the knock at my door the following Saturday morning. It was my dad. He stood there on my porch, looking older than I remembered, with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. My mom was behind him, her arms crossed tightly, like she was bracing for an argument. "Hi," I said, gripping the doorframe. "What's going on?" "We need to talk," my dad said, his tone firm but not unkind. I stepped aside, letting them in. The silence that followed was suffocating as they stood awkwardly in my living room, their eyes scanning the space like they were trying to imagine themselves there. "Look," my dad started, dropping the bag at his feet. "We've been thinking about what you said, and we get it. You've got your life, your space. We understand why you don't want us here." I stayed quiet, waiting for the but I knew was coming. "But we're out of options," my mom cut in, her voice shaking. "We've looked into rentals. Everything's too expensive. Lisa can't." She paused, correcting herself. "Lisa won't take us in, and we don't have anywhere else to go." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I know Lisa said no, but hearing it framed like that made it worse. "I said I'd help you find something," I reminded them, trying to keep my voice steady. "I meant that." "We know," my dad said, running a hand through his hair. "But the thing is, we don't just need a roof over our heads. We need family." "Family," I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended. "Is that what we are?" Because for most of my life, I didn't feel like it. My mom's face fell, but I pressed on. "You sold our house without telling me. You put Lisa's happiness above everything else, time and time again. And now you're here, asking me to fix the mess you're in, because she won't." "We made mistakes," my dad admitted, his voice heavy. "A lot of them, and I'm sorry. But we're still your parents. Doesn't that mean something?" I didn't know how to respond. Of course it meant something, but how much? Enough to let them move in and disrupt the life I'd fought so hard to build? "I don't know if I can do this," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. My mom stepped closer, her expression softening. "We're not asking you to forgive us. Not completely. But we're asking for a chance to make things right." The weight of her words hung in the air. A chance. Was I ready to give them that? Could I? I looked at the duffel bag at my dad's feet, at the lines on his face I hadn't noticed before. They weren't perfect. Far from it. But they were still my parents, and part of me still wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something better. "I need some rules," I said finally. "If you're going to stay here, it has to be on my terms. No overstepping. No guilt trips. And this is temporary. Do you understand?" My dad nodded immediately, relief washing over his face. My mom hesitated for a moment before doing the same. "Thank you," she said softly. As they settled into the guest room that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just crossed a line I could never go back from. I wasn't sure if I'd made the right decision, but it was done. What would you have done? Opened the door or kept it closed? Is there a line where family stops being family? Or do we owe them something, no matter what? It's been 3 months since my parents moved in. 3 months of learning how to share my space with the same people who used to drive me crazy, and still do sometimes. At first, it was like walking on eggshells. My mom would tiptoe around the kitchen like she was afraid to touch anything, and my dad spent most of his time outside, fixing things in the yard that didn't need fixing. We barely talked about anything beyond the surface. The weather, what we wanted for dinner, whether the mail had arrived. But slowly, things started to shift. One evening, I came home from work to find my mom in the living room, flipping through an old photo album she'd found in one of their boxes. She looked up when I walked in and smiled, holding up a picture of me as a kid, standing in front of our old house with a gap-toothed grin. "You always loved that swing," she said, her voice soft. I sat down beside her, and for the first time in years, We talked about the good memories without the shadow of what came after. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it felt like a step toward understanding. My dad was harder to crack. He's not the type to talk about feelings, so I didn't expect much. But one Saturday morning, as we were both drinking coffee on the porch, he surprised me. You know, he said, staring out at the yard, I always thought we'd get it right. Being parents, I mean. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of things. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. We messed up, he continued. With you, with the house, with a lot of things. I can't fix the past, but I'm hoping we can do better now. Hearing those words didn't magically erase the hurt, but it softened something in me. There were still rough patches, like the time my mom suggested we invite Lisa and Todd over for dinner, and I almost laughed out loud. Or when my dad offered to fix my leaky faucet and ended up flooding the kitchen. But in between those moments were quieter ones. Morning coffee on the porch, watching bad reality TV together, my mom teaching me her secret pancake recipe. I wasn't sure how long they'd stay. Part of me was afraid they'd never leave, that I'd wake up one day and realize I'd traded my independence for a second chance at being the good kid. But another part of me, the part that still wanted a family, hoped that when they did move out, we'd be better for having shared this time. Lisa came by once for a quick visit. She brought wine and flowers, like she was trying to overcompensate for saying no to them. We sat around the table, making small talk that felt strained and forced. My parents didn't say much, but I noticed the way my mom's eyes lit up when Lisa complimented the dinner. When Lisa left, my mom looked at me and said, "She's trying." "So am I," I replied, and for the first time, it felt like she understood what I meant. One night, after my parents had gone to bed, I sat in the quiet of the living room, looking around at the space that had once been entirely mine. It felt different now, not better, not worse, just different. On the coffee table was the photo album my mom had been flipping through earlier. I opened it to a picture of the old house, with all of us standing on the front porch. I traced my finger over the edges, wondering if that version of us had ever really existed, or if it was just a snapshot of a moment that couldn't last. I didn't have all the answers, and maybe I never would. But as I closed the album and turned off the light, I felt a strange kind of peace. Sometimes, family isn't about fixing what's broken. Sometimes it's about finding a way to live with the cracks. Do you think people can truly change? Or do we just learn to see them differently? Could this ever lead to healing? Or is it just a band-aid on something that's too far gone? By the fourth month, I started to see patterns. Little things here and there that reminded me why I distanced myself from my parents in the first place. It started small. My mom rearranged my kitchen cabinets because it didn't make sense to keep plates near the sink. My dad decided to fix my mailbox, even though it wasn't broken, and ended up breaking it in the process. But the real cracks began to show when Lisa came up in conversation again. It was a rainy Friday night, and we were sitting at the dinner table, eating spaghetti that my mom insisted on making even though I'd planned to order takeout. My dad was talking about how much he missed Bentley, Lisa's dog, and out of nowhere, my mom sighed dramatically. "I just wish she'd visit more," she said, twirling her fork in her spaghetti. I kept my mouth shut, but I could feel the words bubbling up. "She's busy," my dad said, not looking up from his plate. "Too busy to see her parents?" My mom shot back. Then she turned to me. "You should talk to her. Maybe she'll listen to you." I set my fork down. Why would she listen to me? She barely talks to me, either. My mom gave me that look, the one she always gave when she thought I was being difficult. "You're her sister. You should reach out. And she's your daughter," I snapped. "Maybe you should be the one reaching out." The room went silent. My dad coughed awkwardly, and my mom just stared at me, her expression a mix of hurt and frustration. "Why do you always have to make everything so difficult?" she finally said. That was it. That one sentence was like a match to a pile of dry leaves. "I'm making things difficult?" I said, my voice rising. "You're living in my house because she refused to let you stay in hers. And I'm the one making things difficult?" "We didn't ask for this," my mom shot back, her voice breaking. "We didn't ask for any of this. We're doing the best we can." "So am I," I shouted. "Do you think this is easy for me? Letting you move in after everything? Trying to pretend like I don't resent you for the way you've treated me my whole life?" "Enough," my dad said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. I looked at him, expecting him to defend her, to tell me I was overreacting. But he didn't. "We've made mistakes," he said, his tone calm but firm. "And we're going to keep making them, because we're human. But this can't be how we live. We're not going to fix anything by tearing each other apart." For a moment, no one said anything. The rain outside was the only sound, tapping against the windows like a metronome keeping time. I need some air, I said, pushing back my chair. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out onto the porch, letting the rain soak into my hair and clothes. The cool air felt sharp against my skin, but it was better than sitting at that table, drowning in all the things we couldn't say to each other. After a while, I heard the door creak open behind me. It was my dad. He stepped out, closing the door quietly behind him, and stood beside me without saying a word. "You're right," he said after a long pause. I turned to him surprised. "We haven't been fair to you," he continued. "Not then, not now. And I don't blame you for being angry. I didn't know how to respond, so I just looked out at the rain. We're trying," he said. "I know it doesn't always feel that way, but we are. And if us being here is making things worse, say the word, and we'll go. We'll figure something out." I took a deep breath, the anger slowly draining from me. "It's not that I want you to leave," I said quietly. I need you to understand how hard this is for me." He nodded, his shoulders slumping a little. "I do. More than you know." We stood there for a while, the rain easing into a gentle drizzle. For the first time, it felt like we were on the same page. Not completely, but enough. Things didn't magically get better after that night. In some ways, they got harder. But for the first time in years, it felt like we were at least trying to meet each other halfway. The question was, how long could it last? The uneasy truce after that rainy night didn't last as long as I'd hoped. We were all trying. My parents were more considerate about the little things, and I was trying to let go of the resentment, but the weight of the past has a funny way of sticking around. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of those lazy days where the house felt too quiet. My mom was in the kitchen, making her famous chicken pot pie, while my dad tinkered in the garage. I was on the couch scrolling through my phone when Lisa's name popped up on my screen. "Hey," she said when I answered. "Hey," I replied, surprised. She wasn't exactly in the habit of calling me. "Just wanted to check in," she said, her tone overly casual. "How's everything going? With Mom and Dad?" I almost laughed. "Why do you care?" She sighed, the exasperated kind she used to do when we were kids. "Don't start, okay? I just want to know how they're doing." "They're fine," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "They're settling in?" "Good," she said quickly, like she didn't want to dwell on it. Then she added, "I was thinking about stopping by next weekend. Do you think that would be okay?" "Sure," I said, though my stomach twisted at the thought. Lisa had a way of showing up like nothing was wrong, glossing over any tension with fake smiles and overly enthusiastic compliments. When she arrived the following Saturday, it was exactly as I'd expected. She breezed in with a tray of homemade cookies and a cheerful, "Hey, everyone," like she was the favorite aunt dropping by for a visit. My parents lit up when they saw her. My mom hugged her tightly, and my dad practically tripped over himself offering her a drink. It was like watching a highlight reel of every family dynamic that had ever made me feel small. "You've done such a great job with the place," Lisa said, looking around my living room. "It's so cozy." "Thanks," I said flatly. She stayed for dinner, and for most of the evening, I kept my mouth shut. I let her talk about her latest project at work, her plans for a vacation with Todd, and how Bentley had learned a new trick. My parents hung on every word like she was a celebrity. But then, somewhere between dessert and coffee, she dropped the bomb. "So," she said, swirling her wine glass, "Mom told me about the rental you found for them. It sounds nice." I blinked, caught off guard. "What rental?" Lisa frowned, glancing at my mom. "The one you were helping them with. Mom said you were looking into places nearby." My mom shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I didn't want to bother you with it," she said quickly. "Lisa offered to help us find something." I stared at her, my jaw tightening. "You didn't want to bother me? You're living in my house. How is this not my business?" "Calm down," Lisa said, holding up a hand like she was defusing a bomb. "We're just trying to figure out what's best for everyone." "Oh, are we?" I snapped, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're just swooping in to play savior while I'm the one dealing with everything." "That's not fair," Lisa said, her tone sharp now. "Isn't it?" I shot back. "You said no when they asked to move in with you. You let me take the hit, and now you want to step in and act like you're the hero." "That's enough," my dad said, his voice stern. "No, it's not," I said, my voice shaking. "Because I've spent my whole life being enough. Enough to be ignored, enough to be left out, enough to clean up the messes no one else wants to deal with. And I'm tired of it." The room fell silent. My mom looked like she wanted to cry, my dad looked exhausted, and Lisa, she just looked uncomfortable. "I'm going for a walk," I said, standing abruptly. When I came back, Lisa was gone. My parents didn't say much, and neither did I. But later that night, my mom knocked on my bedroom door. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice tentative. I nodded, and she sat down on the edge of the bed, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "You're right," she said after a long pause. "We put too much on you, and I'm sorry. For all of it." Her words felt sincere, but they also felt like too little, too late. "I don't want an apology," I said quietly. "I want things to change." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "We'll try," she said. "An apology is one thing. Change is another." And while my mom's words gave me hope, the days that followed would test whether my family could truly make things right, or if it was all just empty promises. The apology lingered in the air for days. My mom's words, "We'll try," felt like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Part of me wanted to believe her, but another part, the cynical part, kept whispering, "People don't change." Not really. It wasn't long before that promise was put to the test. The first challenge came a week later, when Lisa texted me out of the blue. "Hey, thinking about inviting Mom and Dad over for dinner this weekend. You should come too. Todd wants to see everyone." I stared at the message for a long time. The idea of sitting at Lisa's perfectly curated dinner table, listening to her talk about her perfect life, made my stomach turn. But if I didn't go, it would only reinforce the gap between us and give her more ammunition to paint me as the difficult one. I finally replied with a curt "Fine." "What time?" When the night came, I drove to Lisa's house with my parents in tow. The atmosphere in the car was tense, but no one said anything. My mom kept smoothing her skirt, and my dad just stared out the window, his jaw tight. Lisa's house was as picture-perfect as her Instagram. A neatly trimmed lawn, a wreath on the door, and the smell of garlic and herbs wafting from the kitchen. She greeted us with her usual bubbly energy, hugging everyone like we hadn't seen each other in years. Dinner started off fine. Todd made small talk about work, Lisa gushed about Bentley, and my parents chimed in with updates on their temporary stay at my house. I stayed quiet, pushing my food around my plate and waiting for the inevitable moment when things would go south. It didn't take long. "So, how's it been living with Mom and Dad?" Lisa asked, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. I took a sip of my wine, stalling. "It's fine," I said finally. "Really?" she said, tilting her head. "Because Mom mentioned there were some tensions." I set my glass down, careful not to grip it too tightly. "It's an adjustment," I said, my voice even. "But we're managing." Lisa smiled, but there was something condescending about it, like she was waiting for me to crack. "Well, I'm glad you're able to help. I mean, with everything Todd and I have going on, we just couldn't." "Don't." I cut her off, my tone sharper than I intended. Her eyes widened, and the table went silent. "Don't pretend like you didn't have a choice," I said, looking directly at her. "You could have helped, but you didn't want to. So don't act like you're some selfless martyr." "Okay, that's enough," Todd said, his voice calm but firm. "No, let her finish," Lisa said, her tone icy now. Clearly, she has a lot to say. "Yeah, I do," I snapped. "Like how you've always gotten a free pass while I've been cleaning up the messes you leave behind. You think I wanted Mom and Dad living with me? You think it's been easy for me?" "That's not fair," Lisa said, her voice rising. "You don't know what I've had to deal with." "Really?" I said, laughing bitterly. "What have you dealt with, Lisa? Tell me." "Because from where I'm standing, you've had everything handed to you while I've been left to figure it out on my own." "That's not true," she shot back. "Enough," my dad's voice boomed, silencing the room. We all turned to him, stunned. He rarely raised his voice, but when he did, it carried weight. "This isn't helping anyone," he said, his tone calmer now but still firm. "We've made mistakes. All of us. But if we're going to fix this family, we need to stop tearing each other apart." No one said anything after that. The rest of dinner was quiet, awkward. When it was over, I left without saying goodbye. The argument at Lisa's house lingered like a bad taste. I avoided her texts and calls, and she didn't make much effort to reach out either. My parents, meanwhile, tiptoed around the subject, as if ignoring it would make it go away. But then one night, my mom knocked on my bedroom door again. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, and she sat down beside me, holding a steaming mug of tea. "You were right," she said after a long pause. "At dinner. About how we've treated you and Lisa differently." I looked at her surprised. "We didn't mean to," she continued, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. "But we did. And I'm sorry." Her words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't the first time she'd apologized, but this time felt different. This time, it felt real. Her apology felt genuine, but apologies don't erase years of hurt. The question now was, could we rebuild, or was it too late to fix what was broken? It's strange how life works. You spend years carrying the weight of old hurts, convinced that they'll never go away. Then, in one moment, everything shifts. Not because the pain disappears, but because you decide to stop letting it control you. That moment came the morning my parents announced they'd found a place to live. It was a simple announcement. My dad casually mentioned over breakfast that they'd signed a lease on a small rental a few miles away. My mom chimed in, saying how much they appreciated my help and how they'd be moving out by the end of the month. I didn't know how to feel. Relief, maybe? Sadness? A mix of both? I hope this doesn't mean you'll stop coming around, my mom said, her voice light but tinged with worry. Of course not, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. The weeks leading up to their move were a blur of packing, paperwork, and emotional goodbyes. My parents tried to leave my house better than they found it. My dad fixed a mailbox he'd broken, and my mom scrubbed every surface until it gleamed. It was their way of saying thank you without using the words. Lisa even showed up to help on moving day. She brought donuts and coffee, acting like nothing had happened at dinner a few weeks before. I kept my distance, but at one point, when we were both standing by the moving truck, she looked at me and said, "I'm sorry for everything. It wasn't much, but it was a start." When the last box was loaded and the house was finally quiet, I sat on the couch, staring at the empty space where my parents' things had been. It felt strange, like the end of a chapter one didn't even know I'd been writing. My parents hugged me before they left, both of them holding on a little longer than usual. "Thank you," my mom said, her voice breaking. "You're welcome," I said, my throat tight. As I watched their car pull out of the driveway, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. The months after they moved out were quiet. Too quiet at first. I'd grown used to having them around, even if it hadn't always been easy. But over time, I settled back into my routine, rediscovering the space I'd fought so hard to protect. My relationship with my parents wasn't perfect, but it was better. They called more often, not just to ask for something, but to genuinely check in. We started meeting for dinner every other week, alternating between their rental and my house. Lisa and I were still a work in progress. We didn't talk often, but when we did, it felt less like walking on eggshells and more like two people trying to find common ground. One day, while flipping through an old photo album, I came across a picture of the house we grew up in. The swing in the yard, the porch with green shutters, the patch of peeling wallpaper in the hallway. It was all still there in my memory, even if the house itself was long gone. I realized then that it wasn't the house I missed. It was the idea of it, a place where we all belonged, where we were a family, even when things weren't perfect. Maybe that's what I'd been chasing all along. Not the house, not the approval I thought I needed, but the feeling of belonging. The story ends with me standing in my own backyard, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. It's quiet, but it's a good kind of quiet, the kind that feels like peace. In the distance, I hear my phone buzz. It's my mom, sending me a picture of the new curtains she's hung in their rental. I smile, typing a quick reply. They look great. Can't wait to see them in person. As I put my phone down, I realize something. Family isn't about where you live or how much you've hurt each other in the past. It's about the choice to keep showing up, even when it's hard. And for the first time in years, I feel like I'm ready to make that choice. What does family mean to you? Is it something we're born into, or something we create through the choices we make?